Wonderful. Thank you to all of the speakers for those terrific presentations. We're now going to hear from our two discussants. I will introduce them both first, and then we'll hear first from Allison and then Dave. So Allison Campbell is the head of Digital Health Oncology R&D for AstraZeneca, and she recently served as the global head of patient-centered outcomes research at Genentech and Roche. Dave Dubin is a patient advocate for awareness, screening, and genetic testing, which he arrived at as a result of his experience at being diagnosed with colon cancer at a very early age and diagnosed with Lynch syndrome. Dave's the founder of AliveAndKickn, a nonprofit organization dedicated to education, advocacy, and research related to Lynch syndrome. So Allison, we'll start with your comments, please, and then we'll go to Dave. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I'd really like to thank all the presenters for sharing their research that leverages emerging technology to increase the evidence base for new treatments while also improving cancer care. Meaningful progress on problems as critical as these to solve can only be done when we partner and collaborate as a research community. Key themes I took from the excellent presentations were first the dignity, comfort, and empowerment and equality of a patient when they can contribute their data from home. This may also avoid harms that can arise from an in-person interaction at a clinic during the pandemic. I think we all know that feeling when you go to see a provider or go in for imaging screening and climb into that gown. And instantly you're transformed from an equal into a patient and you feel different. And by contributing data digitally, that helps change this dynamic. However, that data also needs to be fed back to patients to improve their outcomes, as mentioned in the presentation by Citizen. Dr. Peterson's work focused on multimodal digital therapeutics and their potential to provide richer, deeper data for the early detection of benefits and harms. Dr. Bosch also highlighted the untapped potential in his work. To take digital from a pilot phase into full integration into care, multimodal evidence collection is key. We need bidirectional data to serve as anchors, such as digital symptoms paired with devices to ensure validity. This helps the construction of actionable scoring algorithms that are linked to clinically meaningful changes in health states for patients. We also need to create these systems with patient and provider input on design to ensure seamless integration into the workflow and maximize usability and impact. Continuous monitoring of cancer dynamics and routine care, both of progression and tolerability, to inform the use of marketed therapies and applying these learnings iteratively back into clinical trials, both in their conduct and in their design, is the way we construct a meaningful digital data ecosystem that will serve patients moving forward. Finally, I'd like to reiterate the point on reimbursement. Substantial billing codes are truly needed to support the development and maintenance of digital solutions, especially when many are regulated as software as a medical device with code that will be updated over time as more evidence is available to train the algo, thereby increasing its effectiveness. Pre-COVID, many companies innovating in this space would lose funding or face challenges proceeding when extremely low reimbursement valuations were obtained for their technology. For example, one I won't name had a $2.30 reimbursement when they were replacing a clinician-based intervention that would have been over $10,000. We can't make a business case feasible for their survival without thinking about the reimbursement of this technology and how it serves the health system and patients. We need to recognize and incentivize these innovations appropriately. I feel the work shown throughout today presented a shift change in the incorporation of digital solutions, all with improving the goal of care for patients with cancer. And it was a great day, and thanks for the opportunity to participate and comment.
Thank you, Allison. So Dave, can we have your comments, please?
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here. Full disclosure, I'm also VP of Sales for Kailos Genetics, a CLIA lab. In listening to the talks and going through the history over the last several weeks, especially as it pertains to the Lynch syndrome community, we're coming to an overlying theme of a lot of information, a lot of scared people out there, especially. In the Lynch syndrome world, you have a number of people who are visiting a number of different types of physicians on any given time, ranging from oncologists to gastroenterologists to OBGYNs, And because of that, you have a lot of information that is not necessarily transferable. And in having the conversation about telehealth and interoperability, I think it's important to note that there are so many people who are traveling a distance in order to see a specialist, that the concept of telehealth is not new in the world of Lynch syndrome. It's already there because people are trying to accommodate their screening on a regular basis without having to travel as much. When we created the registry at AliveAndKickn, we had a couple of things that we needed to focus on. One was real world data. So all of the patients who are in the registry have consented to share their information. And that's going to be important when it comes to trying to get any information out there and also get research done. So you have a group of patients who are engaged. They're willing to share their data. It's real world, so they're consented. And you have researchers who are able to access information that they would not otherwise be able to do so. At the same time, we're using clinically valid tools like ClinWiki to find clinical trials for Lynch syndrome. So these are clinically valid tools that allow patients to find clinical trials that are maybe either in their area or at a distance that they can access, that will enable them to find clinical trials in their frame. But first and foremost, under COVID-19, a lot of the conversation has been around time between visits. For those who don't know my story, my colon cancer came back a year after a clean colonoscopy. So in the Lynch syndrome world, you have a lot of people who are concerned that going more than a year between tests is too much, even if it's 14 months, 15 months. So by providing telehealth and allowing them to consult with physicians over the phone or video chats, they get that concern taken out of the equation and they feel comfortable having these conversations, even if it's just a conversation to discuss anything that they're feeling. And it has been enabling them to get through a very difficult time with a lot of stress. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And I just want to remind people who are listening to please go ahead and put your questions for the panelists in the box on the screen. I'm not seeing questions come up yet, so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question. One thing that we worry about a lot with patient-facing digital platforms is patient engagement. And I guess I'd like to ask, well, whichever panelist wants to respond, you can raise your hand. If I don't see a hand raised, I'll call on somebody. But I'd like to hear from any of the panelists about how can we enhance patient engagement? What are some of the best practices for doing that? And what should we avoid if we want to engage patients with use of these technologies? Allison. Thanks.
Yeah, I think
Dave, okay.
I'll be fast.
And then Allison, Dave, and then Ethan.
I think it's such a great question. And one of the things we're focused on right now is we're building a lot of patient-facing digital tools to serve as the backbone of digital therapeutics. And as part of that, we have patients and patient advocates involved from the first day, from the design phase, focus testing, user group testing, minimum viable product, getting it in the hands of patients. And so I think when you start out designing a system with feedback from the eventual user and the provider, I think that increases the ability for it to be useful in workflow. But I also think it's about feeding data back to patients. Historically, we collect a lot of data from patients for the FDA, for payers, for research, but we don't feed it back. And so I think by also creating something bidirectional that Dr. Bosch mentioned earlier, patients are incentivized to participate because they're receiving benefit. And so I think it's including patients in the design, but then also feeding them their data back to improve their outcomes.
Great. Thanks. Dave?
I don't have to answer anymore.
Okay, that captured it.
Yep.
Okay, Ethan, I think you were next.
Yeah, I barely have to answer anymore. I totally agree with Allison as well, and I guess with Dave. I mean, I would say, you know, what's been observed in research is that there are highly variable rates of patient engagement. There are reports of attempts to implement these systems with very, very low rates of uptake and patient use, and similar reports of extremely high rates of use. And the you know, as some people call it, the special sauce, or the features of approaches that seem to be stickier or more engaging, are those in which patients are aware from the beginning that this is an important part of their care processes, that this is something that their care team would like them to be a part of, and that it's really de rigueur in how care is being delivered. I think the adjunct to that is that it truly must be integrated into care, as Allison alluded to. And this means that the care team needs to be feeding back to patients on the information the patients provide through whatever medium they're providing it, whether it's a monitoring device or an ePro. We all have had the experience of filling out a questionnaire in a clipboard, and we just have a sense that that piece of paper is going to go into a filing cabinet somewhere. Nobody's ever going to look at it, and it's really just completely futile. And we run the risk of translating that feeling to the electronic setting, where people can be asked many, many questions over and over again, and that can be very frustrating. And the final piece I'd say is that the systems that are successful are those where there is ongoing monitoring of uptake and use, such that if there are patients who are not engaged and not using the system, they are approached generally by a human, but it can be automated, to figure out why it is that they're not using the system, to try to engage them more and figure out how to bring them more into the fold, so that we don't have systematic missingness of information from certain patients or patient groups.
Okay, thank you. And Susan?
Yeah, I'm not much more to add to that, other than to say that I think this is a really critical conceptual area of research that I think still needs to be an important part of the implementation, as well as Allison stated, the development of these types of interventions. And there needs to be a recognition that engagement in phase one at the beginning may not equal engagement as we proceed along the way. And so we really need to learn a lot about this area. And a testament to that is the number of Fitbits that sit in people's desk drawers after they receive them as Christmas gifts or acquire them themselves, and the number of mobile apps that never get used and get downloaded and get erased eventually. So again, just to underscore that from a focus, a research perspective, that this needs to be a critical area that we need to learn about, and is oftentimes not really considered in the development and the implementation.
Great, thank you.
Can I just
make one addition? See Devin.
If I could just make one addition to Susan's point, I think sure. the feedback that also the providers, the physicians, need to be able to believe in it as well, because there is a lot of pushback from physicians to have yet another channel of information coming at them that they're going to need to respond to. And so if we're not, if they're not seeing the value also, if we're seeing patients drop off from their utilization and not asking, I notice you haven't been wearing your Fitbit, but I think it's really important to do so because it helps me understand that you're doing well or that you're declining. That type of feedback from their physician could be very powerful, but the physicians need to be feeling like it is providing that value in order to encourage that feedback loop.
Excellent point. Thank you. And Devin, you had your hand raised, and then there's a question in the box that I think is tailor-made for you.
Oh, sure. Do you want to, I was going to add only something very short to the other one, but if you want to go ahead and ask the question, then I think we.
Okay. So the question comes from Doug Peterson at UConn Health. The presenters and discussants have described several innovative concepts and technologies. Thank you. What is the optimal approach to assure that the information being delivered to patients over time represents their most current medical data in ways that remain compliant with evolving federal and state regulations?
Okay, great. Thank you. So just on the other points around sort of patient engagement, I think it's a slightly different challenge for those of us who are consumer facing, right? Where if we get integrated in care at all, it's because the patient has chosen to do so. There won't be a patient that will use a Citizen app unless he or she has decided that that's of value to them. So it makes it actually as much of a challenge, or some might argue even more, because we don't have a product unless patients actually find it valuable to use and actually use it to help get their own care, the best possible care for themselves, but also we do empower our users to donate to research too. So
how do we make sure that we have the most current medical data? I think we go directly to healthcare providers using the HIPAA right of access and say, all the data in the designated record set, but that's a one-time ask, which we need to do continuously in order to keep that record up to date, which does put some onus on the user, the patient, to actually tell us, well, I just went to the doctor again. And so we'll go, do another sweep and get those records and update the record in that way. We do prompts to remind them of this. But there are also, in terms of the interoperability rules that came out of the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT and the movement towards making more and more data that could be valuable to the patient and the patient has a right to, accessible just by the patient connecting an app to a certified electronic health record technology. Today, you don't get that much data by connecting an app. You get a few things, but not nearly as much as a cancer patient would need. But to the extent that we're on this trajectory where there will be more and more robust access through these kind of direct connections, that'll make things a lot easier. Compliance with law, that the HIPAA right of access is actually something that and these new interoperability rules that Kristen Rosati referred to in the prior in the prior panel are actually legal requirements. So in some respect, there's sort of no longer an ability for a healthcare provider to say, well, I'll do that. That seems like a nice thing to do, but I'll get to it at some point down the road. It's actually, an imperative. And then again, queuing back on the last panel, we still need to make sure that there's a privacy regime in place so that the companies that are capturing this data on behalf of consumers and patients actually have to abide by privacy rules that are robust and that build a trusted environment for all of that. It's a lengthy response.
Okay.
I apologize for that. I know we have
no,
but
thank you. Great response. So we also have a question for Allison and Ethan. How do Allison and Ethan see the difference between outcome measures for clinical care compared to regulatory use? From Paul Klutz.
Yeah, hi. Allison asked if I could take it first, I think. Or Allison, did you? Yeah, that's what you're
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah. All right. Well, why don't you go first, Allison?
Okay. So it's a great question, Paul. Thanks for asking. I really think it depends on the intended use. If we're developing a digital therapeutic, it would depend on the specific claim, whether that claim is adherence, a reduction in incidence and severity of adverse events against the approved label, reduction in ER visits, or what Ethan demonstrated in 2017 with survival. I think the same piece would be about if we're looking at progression, so using digital symptoms to determine progression in head and neck cancer or non-small cell lung cancer, it would be related to that claim and the empirical evidence provided. What I think is interesting about the interplay of routine care and clinical trials is the volume of empirical evidence we could supply the agency for review regarding the performance of these treatments in a more generalizable population, these treatments and tools for regulatory review. But I do think it is still separate from a descriptive clinical outcome assessment labeling claim for, say, tolerability in a clinical trial, or an efficacy benefit claim for disease symptom in a clinical trial, or a digital therapeutic claim. But these are things we're very interested in having further discussion with the FDA on. But Ethan, you want to go ahead?
I as usual, I have nothing to add. I think you covered it all, and I agree.
Okay. Great, thank you. One last question we have from Charles Bornstein at MD Anderson. Is there an established framework or set of best practices for deploying Fitbits for research protocols? So Susan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so there are a number of best practices that you need to attend to in order to assure that you're getting useful data. And I think that starts with good interaction initially with the users, much like what Mia was saying about sort of the onboarding with regard to telehealth. You need to onboard your participants well and make sure that they understand the use of the device. We have a number of users in our studies who don't routinely download mobile apps. They don't routinely wear devices like this. And so the degree of coaching can vary depending on level of the user. And then there's the actual use itself. That's important. And then, of course, monitoring the data that come in over time to make sure that what you're getting seems reasonable, and whether or not there's a need to intervene to coach people, coach participants on how to best use them. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists. This was a terrific discussion. Enjoyed hearing from all of you, as I'm sure your audience did as well. And thank you to the audience for the questions. So wonderful job.
I wanted to thank Karen and everybody else as well. This has been a terrific panel. It's a lot to think about, a lot to chew on. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And everyone have a good evening. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock Eastern time. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you all.